Bullets and Souls. Chapter 1. Life Before Sailing. There are many horse-drawn carriages traveling back down this street, their wheels and hooves rolling in the mud, mixing with the crisp ringing of bells to create the rhythm of a European town. This, however, was a nameless town in Cambodia. Poor women were walking back and forth near every rickety little restaurant, clutching an assortment of fruits and greens. Their men were either off gambling or getting drunk in the tavern at the end of the street, and I was one of those in the tavern. Of course, my woman wasn't in the line of those holding plants for sale along the street. I was surrounded by a lot of familiar faces who offered to talk to me whenever they got slightly drunk and hiccuped. "Wayne, I heard you're mixed Chinese and Korean, right?" Wayne is my name, and many men like to talk about my lineage without being interested in their women selling food on the street. I said yes, my mother was a Korean woman, and the girl my father rescued from the enemy in that gallant fight was my mother, who then ran away to China against all odds to marry that soldier, and after that I was born. "Oh, that's right. Then why are you in Cambodia? Don't you go back to your own country?" I laughed and said, "I don't have a country or nationality right now, but I've made this muddy town my country." "Haha, funny you say that. How did you come to Cambodia?" I like to talk to them and treat them sincerely because I am grateful for their women. There are a lot of good-looking ones among those women, and while these drunks come home and hug them and let off a little steam, I can use the money I spend on vegetables to get such women to come to my house and sleep with me for a while, and they thank me profusely afterwards. That's why I find this town lovely, including its poverty and mud. I went on to answer the curious drunks by saying that when I was 8 years old, I was playing in the mountains along the Sino-Vietnamese border because I ran into a camel caravan trafficking in drugs, and those people chased me with plain knives and shot me with guns. But I didn't die, but I could never go back to China. I spent my years wandering to Cambodia and to this muddy town. Haha, that's so funny. When are you going to sail, Wayne? And are you willing to leave that sassy woman in the tailor shop? Her round arse just makes men drool when they look at it. I smiled lightly, knowing they weren't laughing at me, they were just curious about my life. I've been flirting with the widow in the tailor's shop for a long time. It was well known in this town, especially by the men in the tavern. From time to time, I also got drunk. My eyes were blurred, and I was confused in my consciousness, after which I stumbled to find her. Whenever she saw me staring at her with red, drunken eyes, she hurriedly greeted the customers in the shop and closed the door. Then she helped me to her bed and left me to vent on her voluptuous and seductive body. People in the town have seen this strange. No one will come to eavesdrop or make trouble. Even in later years, the women remained cordial to her. I am a vagabond in this town. The only difference is that I rarely leave the town, only during the sailing season when they think I am working. I told the man who asked me that I was likely to leave within the week. The owner of the hotel treated me with extra respect every time he poured me a full glass of wine, which made me feel very warm. I don't know if the owner regarded me as the signature character of the tavern, or I regarded this tavern as my home. The owner was a tiny old man. His eyes always rolled up exaggeratedly when he spoke, and he had a jocular demeanor that made him willing to answer any awkward topic. The owner said to me, "Wayne, aren't you betrothed to the 16-year-old daughter of the Zadava family? What about the woman in the tailor's shop?" I said that the woman in the dressmaker's shop knew about it and felt that she was an incomplete woman and couldn't give me what a young girl had, and so was glad of my engagement, and that the only thing that saddened her was whether I would ever go to her again. "Oh, will you keep seeing her, Wayne?" I said, "and I sure will." The 16-year-old girl was beautiful and the Zadava family couldn't afford a girl that age anymore, which was why they wanted me to have her. Whereas a teenage girl's ignorance and virginity could give me perfect love, the woman in the tailor's shop had flawed beauty that couldn't be replaced, and I loved her voluptuous torso and the look on her face when she pleasured me in bed. She was a hell of a thrill for me. "Ah!" laughed the drunks in the hotel. I told them that I was planning to go to the Crozet Islands on this trip. I will exchange some dried fruits and furs for some rare metals on the islands, and if the trip goes well, I will come back and treat everyone to a week's worth of wine. Everyone was very happy to hear this, clapping their hands and giving each other pleasant glances, as if I had just come back and was now starting to buy wine. It was getting close to dusk, and I knew it might rain again tonight. So I left the hotel earlier than usual. The streets were still threaded with horse-drawn carriages left and right, Cars are impractical here, and the pristine nature of this town makes any modern means of transport and communication shy away. After a few steps along the narrow street, I noticed a woman holding a cucumber across the street, staring at me with bright eyes. It was a demure-looking woman with high breasts and a rounded arse. The last time I'd asked her to put the melons in my cozy little loft, I'd paid her double the price of the vegetables at the time and asked her to accompany me to bed. Seeing the sudden doubling of riel, she happily agreed and made out with me very hard. I stopped in my tracks and stood still looking at her in the same way. She was in a humble position, but I didn't run away from her, and her eyes that were trying to communicate with me as quickly as I would have done if I had been avoiding something I thought was shameless. I wasn't trying to ask her at this point to do what she had done last time, as it was getting late and she needed to get home to cook for the kids and satisfy her manly needs. The woman holding the melons walked towards me, smiled unnaturally, and said, "Oh, Wayne, are you going to marry the daughter of the Zadava family? Mine is 14 years old, so you should do the same." She finished by lowering her head and staring in panic at the cucumber in her arms. I had never seen her daughter and doubted she even had one. Asked her why she did it. She said, "Actually, I didn't mean it like that, Wayne. Look at it this way. You marry the Zadava's daughter, and my daughter can be a second wife or a servant to you. As long as you can keep her fed, the child is too big for the family to support. Let her be with you for the rest of her life. You just have to keep her fed. Is that okay? Or I'll go to your attic now." I felt momentarily overwhelmed as I listened to this woman. I thought that this girl must be as dignified looking as her mother. Still, I felt that the 14-year-old girl would weigh down my life and politely refused her. She seemed to be very reluctant and said to me anxiously, "Wayne, you have pity on me. My man gambles all day long, and whenever he loses money, he comes home and tortures us, mother and daughter. I'm really afraid that that devil will sell my child one day. Tell you what, I'll ask her to come to your loft later, and you can see how she looks. She's actually quite a big girl now, so take her body if you want. She's still just like the Zadava's daughter." I really didn't want to say anything more to reject her, although her words sounded irritating, but she had after all sold out and made love to me in order to sustain a struggling family, to be a mother who kept her children fed, and to get that double price for her greens. I should not have any blame on her. I said, "Well, if the rain does not fall much, you call her." Immediately the woman's eyes let out a light of joy, and she said happily, "I will certainly send her to your loft tonight, no matter how hard it rains," said she, and then turned away with joy on her face, as she had done last time. Back in that dark attic, I picked up the oil lamp and collapsed my alcohol-anesthetized body defiantly into the heavy bed. I closed my eyes, and the light from the paraffin lamp reflected into my brain through my eyelids. I thought about the woman selling cucumbers, about the day when her plump breasts annexed my face in its entirety as if floating in the ocean, and I thought about whether her daughter would grow up to have the exact same body as her. I didn't extinguish the oil lamp. Even though my eyes were closed, I liked the feeling of having light in my brain. In my dazed consciousness, I felt like I was asleep, not knowing when the storm was raging outside. The rumbling, muffled thunder and the electricity that had flashed before made my brain sticky with drowsiness, slowly slipping into a deeper weariness. Suddenly, a long black shadow of a skewer flashed across my brain's shadows and was instantly drowned out by darkness again. I rolled alertly, lay on my side under the bed, drew the Swiss steel knife I had previously strapped to the leg of the bed, and peered out of the loft. After a long time of no movement, another bolt of lightning slipped through, and the skewer-length black shadow was again projected into the room, and I quickly judged that the original image of this black shadow was a girl, and the shadow zoomed in on the teenage boobs that were beginning to protrude with extreme exaggeration before my very eyes. It was then that I suddenly remembered that it was most likely the daughter of the woman selling cucumbers. I was anxious and cautious, but still carefully opened the door of the room. A body-thin girl in the storm, clutching arms, hair and clothes like muslin stained on the face and body. I think this should be the woman's daughter. Originally, my attic was roofed, and the quiet, vertical fall of rain would not wet the shelter, but tonight's inclement weather had made this little one suffer from the storm. I waved at her, signaling her to come inside quickly. She was melancholy for a moment, trying to move but stopping. I was anxious, knowing that she might be afraid, and waved harder for her to come in again. The wind, rain, and lightning immediately became more violent, as if they were reproaching her for not listening to me, and her fear of the wind and rain finally became greater than her fear of me, and she slowly drew nearer to me. The moment she got very close to me again, she suddenly stopped again and stared warily at my left hand. I then realized that the dagger was still in my hand, and threw it towards the table in the room, and after a bang, the knife stuck into the corner of the table, and I said to her, "Come in, that's my weapon of defense, it's nothing to do with you." Chapter 2. A Visit on a Rainy Night. Chapter 2. A Visit on a Rainy Night. She stood in a corner of the room, her head pressed down so low that water continued to pour from her hair and clothes, dripping onto the wet floor. She was shivering from the cold and panic. I tossed her a towel and gestured for her to wipe herself off. To take away her fear of the cold and the darkness, I started a fire in the fireplace, and the dry pieces of wood burned quickly, the small attic being enveloped by a dim, yellowish glow in the dark, rainy night. The girl was indeed freezing and couldn't help but take a few steps closer to the fire. It was then that I saw her hazel face through the orange light. Underneath a pair of big dark eyes were thin, curved lips, and a luscious, striking nose protruded from a young, round face. This girl's body looked extremely slender in the firelight, and her small breasts, which had just developed in her youth, floated together under her tattered clothes. I hadn't realized that the rain was pouring so hard this evening. Her mother must have tried everything to force her to come to me, and she groped her way to my place and was so timid and overwhelmed that she had to wait outside the door in the rain. A kind of waiting that temporarily stops fear in its tracks and has no way of predicting the consequences. I told her not to be afraid and that no harm would come to her. She didn't seem to trust me and was still subconsciously wary of me. I tried to talk to her again, as I was now out of curls and feeling the boredom of living alone in this room for a long time. I said to her, "Can you tell me your name?" The girl's eyes flashed a little, and she did not speak. I was a little impatient. She was not at all like her mother, who conversed smoothly with me. I lurched over to her, grabbed one of her slender arms, and flung her onto the bed. The girl's face was covered with fear, and she looked at me with tears in her eyes. I asked her angrily, "Are you dumb? You have to talk to me, understand? Otherwise I'll strip you naked and make you sleep with me." The girl listened to my intimidation and rustled tears under her long eyelashes. I asked her again sullenly her name and how old she was. She still cried and didn't speak. I was really angry that she was crying and even suspected that she was really mute. I jumped on her and symbolically tried to pull her clothes. Her panicked look and futile resistance almost made me laugh. I could see her damp body writhing against me as if she were a skinny boy. "Come on, what's your name?" I almost giggled. 13. "Oh, no, almost 15. She finally spoke in a frightened and childish female voice. I figured she was 13, followed by the obvious lie her mother had told her to tell. I pulled down her trousers as soon as I could, trying to deduce her age from her developing organ. I've had a lot of contact with little girls' bodies before, and I've even buried them with my own hands. The bodies of those naked young girls, around 10 years old, with cloths hanging from their bodies, sprawled across the ransacked village, always came back to me in my nightmares. She became more alarmed and struggled violently, curling up her thin legs sharply to protect that shy organ. I could still see the bare part, like a half-ripe green fruit, visually green and tasteless. I thought I could not violate her. She was still a child, and in 7 days I would be at sea, and suppose her lower parts were injured, it would be like a waste to inquire for medical help for the suffering family, and for the mother with the cucumber in her arms. The little girl would surely endure the pain and suffer until her wounds were healed. I let go of her and walked over to the storage cupboard and took a piece of bacon and bread out of it and threw it at her and told her to eat it. Still staring at me with skeptical eyes, I told her, "Eat it all, and you'll be gone at dawn." The girl hesitated for a moment, looking at me and then at the food, and slowly reached over. She took a bite of bread followed by a bite of bacon, and as soon as the flavor of the food in her hand combined with her hungry gut, she couldn't be bothered to be wary of anything anymore and chewed hard. I sat in a chair close to her and kept my eyes on her. This was the only woman who had come into my house and not made love to me. Outside, the thunderstorm was still sharp and violent, and the light from the lightning bolts came in through the window before being diluted by the roaring fire and becoming less blinding. I asked her if she wanted some water, and she shook her head. After a while, she ate all the food in her hand and curled up on the bed against the corner, her eyes fixed on me without moving. Sensing that she was adjusting a bit, I tried talking to her again, asking her name. Her earlier fear and wariness finally calmed down a bit, and she started talking to me. My name is Poe and I have 3 brothers. My mom told me that you are good and told me to come to you and accept whatever you do to me. After saying this, the girl called Poe cried. I told her, "Don't you cry. I won't do anything to you. You will go home at first light." The girl cried and shook her head and whimpered, "I can't go home. If Mr. Wayne doesn't want me, Mummy, she won't want me either." I listened to the girl's cries and knew that her mother was telling the truth. A woman who was that poor could not support her older child much longer. I said to her, "I have 7 days before I have to go to sea, and there is no way I can take you in. So you will go home first thing in the morning." When she heard me, she began to cry again and said pleadingly, "Mr. Wayne, take me away, or I shall have to jump into the sea." I heard her speak a little sadly, but it was still a no for me. So I said seriously, "No, I'm going to the Crozet Islands in Africa. It's a long way to go, and the journey is perilous. In case you meet pirates, you will be in danger. And the ship is mixed with men from various countries, which is a safety hazard for you as a female. But I'm still a child. Didn't you just see my body? I can't attract interest in men." I really wanted to laugh at that moment, but I held back and explained, "That's different. In their eyes, there are no children or adults. As long as it's a female, they won't let it go when they are impulsive. It's like treating a live fish, taking a bite, cutting it, and releasing it back into the sea. As long as they think they can have fun for a while, they don't consider the consequences for the weak." The girl, as if intimidated by me, stopped talking, and we both fell silent. The blackness outside diminished a little, but the sound of the thunderstorm did not subside. I started to get a little sleepy, so I said to her, "I want to sleep." She immediately shivered, and her face, which had been tired, instantly perked up again and said tentatively, "Do you want me with you?" I shook my head and said, "You can go down or squeeze in with me, for this is not a large bed, and it is the only one." The girl hurriedly curled herself up even smaller, clinging to the corner of the bed. I knew she was signaling for me to lie over while she stayed that way herself. I felt my whole body relax as soon as I lay down, comfortably closing my eyes and letting myself fall into sleep. My head could feel the moisture and warmth radiating from her body, a sensation that made me fall asleep faster. I woke up close to noon, bright hot sunlight piercing through the window and stinging my neck. I knew there should have been very little rain left in the streets from last night's baking. The girl fell asleep beside my head, her long, soft hair falling near my nose, still lingering from last night's rain. Much drool flowed from that small, slightly open mouth, diffusing the flavor of bread and bacon. Such a serene and adorable slumber caused me to suddenly have a marvelous feeling, the first in 5 years of waking up alone in the attic. I left some money on the table, these being twice as much as I had given to her mother last time, and found slips of paper and drew a sign, signaling her to go home. When all was settled, I put on my clothes and went again to the tavern for a drink, asking the proprietor of the shop, by the way, if the ship Snoy in Sihanoukville Harbor would dock on time. I drank until late and went back to the loft, pushing open the door the other eye froze. The girl hadn't left and was standing naked in the basin next to the fireplace, washing herself. She lost her voice at my sudden appearance and hurriedly squatted into the basin, clutching her newly protruding breasts and looking at me with wide, frightened eyes. I ignored her and went inside, closing the door behind me. With the alcohol burning my brain and feeling the sky hanging over me, I said to her, "Get a wet towel. My head hurts a little." After that, I collapsed on the bed, closed my eyes, and tried to sleep. I felt her step out of the basin as the water clattered, followed by another clatter. The moment I was about to drift off to sleep, a small pair of cool hands touched my forehead and quickly removed them, then pressed a ball of wet towel to my burning forehead. The headache was cooled considerably, and a relaxing dizziness made me fall asleep quickly. In the middle of the night, I woke up to see her crouched next to the fireplace, hugging her knees and staring at the leaping flames. The sound of me sitting up startled her, and she looked at me, and I looked at her. I asked her, "Have you eaten? Why didn't you take the money and go?" She didn't say anything and pointed to the table. The money was there as usual, next to the bacon and bread from the storage cupboard. I understood. It turned out that taking some money wouldn't change her mother's mind, nor would it make her give up her choice to jump into the sea. And the bacon and bread, I remembered, were the last bits of food left in the cupboard last night, which she wanted to leave for me, having starved herself all day. I told her, "You eat. I'm not hungry right now." She gave me a melancholy look, hung her head again, and shook it. I could tell that this girl was going to leave me with this bit of food. I smiled, got up and walked over to the table, grabbed the bacon and bread, and tossed it to her, telling her to hurry up and eat. She still shook her head stubbornly. This time I wasn't angry, and I didn't want to scare her like I did last night. Knowing that she wouldn't eat it because she was afraid I would drive her away, I said to her, "Eat it, but there is a secret you must keep." After saying this, I crawled under the bed, opened a wooden panel, and disappeared like a loach falling into a swamp. It was an underground chamber that I had secretly set up, stocked with enough food and, of course, munitions. Not long after, I pushed a wooden box and climbed up. The girl looked at me in surprise as I used my dagger to pry open the sealed crate and took out the dried fish fillets inside, tearing them open and giving them to her, telling her to eat them, and stacked the bacon and nuts inside in front of her. It was then that the girl took a hard bite of the fish in her hand, and as I watched her hungry eating, I felt hungry too, and crouched down on the ground with her, chewing up the hard food. The girl locked eyes with me, and we both laughed. I told her, "You talk. I don't like not saying anything. You talk to me and say whatever comes to mind. It's just you and me in this house." The girl coyly lowered her head, stabilized herself, and said, "My mom said that a woman would be happy to marry a man like you." I froze then. As soon as she said her mom, it reminded me of that day in this house. I asked her mom why she said that. She couldn't answer and thought for half a second before saying, "You have a lot of food." Chapter 3. Memories of a Bloody Massacre. Chapter 3. Memories of a Bloody Massacre. I was relieved and thought that her mother had told her daughter about the private deal she had made that day to buy groceries. I asked her if she was afraid of me. She said, "No fear. My mom says you are a good person. You were gentle with her that day and didn't treat her like an inferior woman." It turned out that the girl's mother had told her what happened that day. I asked the girl, "Will you hate me?" The girl shook her head once and said, "No, you're a good person. I hate my dad. He drinks when he loses a bet and comes back to torture my mom or beat me." I didn't say anything and pinched a nut and carved words into it with a dagger. She suddenly opened her eyes again and said, "Will you kill my father? He was always abusing Mom, and sometimes when he couldn't pay back the gambling money, he asked her to sleep with those men. Mom refused at first, but then she couldn't take the beatings, so she gave in. Only then did I understand why the woman holding the cucumber had so many bruises on her body. Now often strange men go to my house. Mom is most worried about me, so if I go home again, she would rather strangle me than let those," she said. She choked back a sob, her eyes red, but did not let the tears fall. I asked the girl why me. She finally couldn't help herself and burst into tears. Sobbing, she said, "They say you are a killer, the man who has killed the most people in this town." I told the girl that I hadn't killed anyone in this town. "But you're the good guy, they're the bad guys, and you've given my mom double the money for the food." I put one of the dried nuts in my mouth, chewing hard on the fruit, and told her raw, "It wasn't gratuitous. Giving your mom double the riel was me wanting her in bed at the time." The girl stopped talking and hung her head again, just shedding tears. Feeling that I shouldn't have used such a mean statement to a poor child, I eased my tone and said, "I'm not a killer. The men of the town fear me because I've killed so many as a soldier, and I've often been generous enough to buy them drinks." The girl stopped crying and blinked her big wet eyes up at me. "Are you a soldier?" Perhaps it was the girl's pearly face that was so touching, her naive loveliness that struck the confiding feelings within me. Outside the house, the same lightning and thunder continued as last night. I told the girl a lot about my past. From the time I wandered in Vietnam and was taken into slavery by mine owners. While drifting to Thailand, I joined the local government's secretly organized mercenary corps at the age of 17. The days of guns and bullets were 6 years long. Killed many armed terrorists and solo missions to kill Western agents. I always thought those people were horrible and deserved to be killed. It wasn't until later that the Bangkok Armaments Department had political disagreements and split into two factions. One faction aggressively strengthened the regular army, while the other secretly formed mercenaries to fight against it. The higher-ups used the mercenary organizations to root out dissidents or to carry out dirty political orders. When the affair is exposed, the mercenaries on the mission are labeled as terrorists and killed by the regular army. During an operation, we were ordered to clean up terrorists at the border. When we arrived, we learned that it was to smash villages formed by displaced people from various countries, and that many children as old as you had been killed and maimed. Do you know China? Japanese soldiers massacred unarmed people in Nanking, and that was the same beastly thing. You can stand in the center of the village and sweep around with abandon, shooting at anything living that has two legs, as long as the target isn't wearing the same uniform. The villagers' eyes, throats, hearts, and small bellies are riddled with holes of ebony blood from the daggers. My group, which consisted of 8 men at the time, was searching and found 2 10-year-old girls hiding in a haystack. They stripped them naked, and the 7 of them kept raping them. I threw up all over the floor when I saw the horror of the scene. 2 of my teammates came over to me and asked me to F***K one of them as well. The 2 girls were dying with blood coming out of their lower bodies. Anger caused my hand to unconsciously draw my dagger and slit the throat of one of the team members, shooting 3 more team members to death with my pistol. The other 3 tackled me and tore me apart. I pulled the grenade engine from my body to die with them. The 3 men saw this and drew themselves up and ran, 2 of them running side by side so fast that they were blown up by the grenade I still had out, and one I picked up and shot with the pistol on the ground. The soldiers around me heard the explosion and all gathered around me. I ran as fast as I could into the jungle, guns firing behind me. Bullets whistled past me, and the branches and leaves around me, shattered and splattered, burst onto my arms and face. I felt 2 bullets hit me, one grazing my ear and another grazing my shoulder. If I had only run 2 centimeters off course, my life would have been lost. Later, I fled to Cambodia, sneaked onto a coal train from Phnom Penh, arrived at Bretamo, walked to Yesen, and from there went up to Koh Kong. I lived in this town for 5 years. There was an underground arms organization in Chopalong City, and every time they took a shipment, they paid a lot of riel for me to protect the scene of the transaction. But I'm not involved in those anymore. Now, every August, I take a boat to the Crozet Islands and do some trading with the natives to earn enough to spend for the year. The girl listened with some forgetfulness, and I peeled off a piece of bacon with my dagger and handed it to her. She took it and said, "The cross-cut scar on your chest. Did you get that from fighting 3 of your team members?" I nodded and asked if it was her mother who had told her about my oddly shaped scar. She nodded back. I told the girl to go to bed. I wanted to sit alone and be quiet. The fire in the fireplace flickered and flickered, its shadows bouncing off the walls. I look over at the sleeping Poe, and then at the sharp rainstorm outside the window, imagining this sea voyage and hoping that there won't be too much of this bad weather on the voyage. At this moment, although I am sitting in a dry and comfortable cabin, my heart is heavy. This sea voyage will take at least 5 months before I can return to the town. After I leave, how to place this girl on the bed? Letting her go home is the same as forcing her into a desperate situation. There were 10 boxes of air-dried food stored in the basement that I wanted to give to Zadava before I left for Sihanoukville. This family, on the brink of starvation, had my young fiancée, and I hoped they would survive my departure. A few days before Poe, the poor child, arrived, Zadava had led Sarit, the daughter who was to marry me, to my loft. The Cambodian man, in his 40s, was hunched over like an old man, whereas the daughter beside him was born with a delicate, clean skin that had obviously been freshly washed. Though dressed in the shabby clothes of a poor family, her body was evenly developed, and her brows and feet exuded the air of a young girl. That very day, Zadava wanted to leave his daughter with me for the night, but I did not agree. I thought that in case I met with danger at sea and could not return safely, leaving my wife, who was young and pregnant, would not be subjecting her and the child in her womb to the sufferings of the world. Zadava, though poor and old and suffering hardships in life, was a simple, upright, and understanding man. Seeing that I was not interested in Sarit only for lust but also for her future, he happily wiped the tears from the corners of his eyes and took his daughter back. As I was leaving, I gave him most of the food in the storage cupboard and told him that I would give him more before I left for the sea. Zadava smiled at me gratefully, and Sarit lifted his pretty little face, looked at me with clear eyes for a moment, and lowered his head again. That was the first time I had ever looked at this 16-year-old girl. No wonder the townspeople said she was the prettiest girl in the area. Now I believed it. The day of the voyage finally arrived, and I gave 7 boxes of food to Zadava, leaving Poe with 2 more boxes of food. And I instructed Poe to look after the loft for me and not to go out and walk around on weekdays. In case of danger, hide in the secret room under the bed, where there is a shotgun to be used for defense in critical moments. After loading the large bags of goods and seagoing necessities on the wagon, I ran to Sihanoukville Harbor. It would take 3 days to reach the destination port from this town. 2 days would be enough if the weather was good enough. The ship Snoy was not going to wait because I was late, so I was in a hurry on the way. The wagon got stuck in a mud puddle several times and couldn't move forward, so I had to carry all the goods off the wagon and then carry them back to the wagon one by one after pulling it up. This is nowhere near as comfortable as sitting in a pub, but in order to have enough riel to go to the pub for a quickie, as usual, for the next year, I have to work out all the kinks now. The only advantage of using a horse-drawn wagon is that you don't need fuel and you don't need to have fodder. The jungle is full of thick branches and leaves, so just unhitch the horse and let him munch for a couple of hours, and he'll go back to pulling me and my luggage towards Sihanoukville. The next night was met with torrential rain. The horses and I had to stop for shelter, and on a 2-meter-high bush I secured the tin I had prepared and leveled the wagon's supplies so that my tired body could lie down and rest. While the lightning was thundering outside, the horses were quiet in the tent, slowly chewing on the plants around them. I ate some dry, hard wax meat and nuts as well, thinking about the feel of the hut and wondering if Poe would be scared alone. I think the Snoy has docked, and tomorrow night it will leave the harbor for the Cape of Good Hope in Africa. The natives of the Crozet Islands, too, must be looking forward to my spices and dried fruits. It was just slightly light, and the rain hadn't turned down yet, but I could wait no longer, or I would be delayed in boarding the ship. I dismantled the tent, wrapped the cargo tightly, and drove the wagon furiously through the rain. By the time I reached Sihanoukville Harbor, the snow was just about to dock, so I filled out the paperwork, carried the cargo into the hold, and went asleep in one of the cramped compartments of the ship. This huge freighter was much more worn out than last year, and it was thought that it hadn't had many encounters with storms and pirates during its year at sea. The huge deck was washed and scrubbed like the skin of a spotted dog, and the captain was still the same short, fat old man, leading the sailors made up of fugitives from all over the world. I wrapped the sheepskin felt around my body tightly and didn't think about them. I had to get an early night's rest, and tomorrow I would have to work with this group of sailors, cleaning the decks and maintaining the masts. The storm increased during the night, and the whole ship rocked back and forth like a baby held in a woman's arms. I had not felt like this for a long time, and the fatigue of 3 days brought me quickly to sleep. Chapter 4. Stowaways in the Cargo Bay. At some point I was awakened by the fierce, sharp tapping of metal, and it turned out to be the short, fat captain, Basadi, who was tapping angrily on the bars above me with his black brass pipe. I crawled up and stood barefoot on the planks under my bed, looking at him with expressionless, languid eyes. "Oh, ha Wayne, see you again." I knew he was pretending to recognize me only then, for when I came on board, I had signed an indenture for second-class traveling, and for this part of the voyage I had to get up early every day and do my work with those sailors, and Basadi was to provide me with 2 meals a day, as required. "Wayne, you're more swarthy after a year of not seeing you. And those second-class indentured passengers are so timid and clumsy they had to be told to hose down the decks. Lookout and mast maintenance only you're fit for. So get to work now in order to reach your destination without incident." This hypocritical little old man, standing up straight, was only 160 centimeters. His gray eyes rolled upwards hard to speak to me, his withered nose wobbling against my chest. I showed no enthusiasm for him. His hypocrisy and cunning were familiar to me. Putting on a thick goatskin cantle, I went up on deck, and the slippery masts, high and huge, stood looking vertically below as if they were poking into the clouds. I gripped the rough cable and climbed barefoot up to the mast lookout position, then adjusted the huge sails according to the wind direction. I was familiar with such a job, having done similar things on ships when I had sailed in past years. The wind was blowing cold up there, and when you couldn't take it, you could block it with a kangaroo. The boat was sailing fast, and the islands behind it were gradually blurring. At dusk, the water was a dark brown color, and the sea became a little dull. The waves were neither high nor fierce, but under the cover of hazy water vapor, they were raging and bulging without a moment's rest. A dozen rough-faced sailors walked about the deck. Their faces were so varied that I could not ascertain their pedigree, and they hardly noticed me. The draft of the schooner was, in my estimation, from 150 to 200 tons. The sides are very broad, the masts thick and spotted, and the sails large enough to make her speed downwind. At the stern of the boat, a dark-faced man was at the helm. His hand is firmly on the handle of the wheel, keeping the sailboat sideways at full speed. When it was time to eat, the ship's hooter sounded, and a thin, sturdy man, standing below, waved and shouted to me. I knew that I was being told to go down, so I followed the mast, grabbed the cable with one hand, and quickly reached the deck. Facing me was a Southeast Asian man, sounding like a Malaysian by the way he gestured his arms and slurred his language. His chest to his calves was hairy, his scarred cheekbones were crisscrossed and sunken, and his whole body looked like a mutant monkey. I went back to my cabin, and the supper was steaming hot, angled over the bed. I was indeed hungry, and, throwing off my sheepskin kangaroo, I picked it up and shoved sausage and bread into my mouth at the same time. Afterwards, lying down in that small, damp hammock, I fell asleep. On the 5th day of the voyage, we found a stranded woman holding a child at sea. She was an Asian with surprisingly pale skin. Perhaps her body had been exposed to the sea for too long, and her body had been overly eroded by the water. As the sea breeze has been blowing hard for several days, and the ship was sailing with the wind, we passed the Cocos Islands yesterday. It is now in the center of the Indian Ocean, bound for Amsterdam. The ship on which this stranded woman was traveling had probably hit a reef and sank, or had been robbed by pirates, and had been forced to jump overboard with her child in her arms to escape. As the sailors pulled them up, they began to talk and gesticulate in a mixture of languages. It was obvious that the men were excited, their eyes staring directly at the breasts, which were extraordinarily full for breastfeeding, and at the outline of the sexy lingerie that covered their hips under the woman's soaking wet bodice. The young woman looked very weak, her arms shivering as she held the child. The child survived on the floating planks by the mother's milk. The woman's lips were a little purple, and the sea must have been freezing cold. The sailors all scrambled to help her off the deck. I think the woman needed food, fresh water, and rest more than the child, and the hammock in the cabin was enough to give her a good rest for the whole day. I climbed back up the mast and continued my lookout. If this woman had jumped overboard because of a shipwreck, then there must be reefs lurking in these waters. If it was an attack from a pirate ship, those pirates must have gone somewhere else by now, out of these waters. At that moment, there was a noise from below. A blonde in a black halter and heavy makeup screamed and rushed onto the deck, hissing at me. Mitchell Disautophthesia, Waputatophis, Wadire Spectan sexual intercourse. Athos Point short, fat captain ran up to her, and, seizing her by the long hair, tugged and pushed her below deck. She struggled desperately to get away, and the captain, with his hands clasping her wrists in a death grip, laughed and said, "Go back to your medicines and go to bed, baby." A couple of menacing sailors rushed up and lifted her away, cursing shrilly as she struggled. I learned English when I was a mercenary in Thailand. I heard that this crazy woman probably means the child fell into the sea, who go to save him, she will have sex with him. I have seen this crazy woman last year, also fell into the sea. I am not sure whether it is American or European, and then to the captain as a wife, half a year to go crazy. In the last few days, standing high up on the mast, I've often seen a couple of male sailors sneaking into the compartment of the ship where the madwoman is kept in her, and the short, fat, old man captain, himself, often came out of it with his trousers up. Among the men who had just carried off the madwoman, there was a tall, muscular, bearded man who was a roving criminal from France. The bare-chested Malaysian sailors looked a lot like his men. I couldn't understand why Basadi, the lewd old man, had hired them. These men seldom went ashore on the ship and were probably used to a life of debauchery floating on the sea. At night, I lay in my hammock in the cabin. It was an unusually fine night. The moonlight spread over the wet deck, and the sea was black and heavy with light and mystery. I thought of my cozy loft and of Poe and Sarit, and as I drifted off to sleep, the sound of errant footsteps came to me on deck, and I slipped my dagger into my boot, and with a close-fitting pistol pinned to my haunches, I sought out the light of the wavering paraffin lamps and made my way up to the deck. I guessed it was the pirates who had spotted us, and the men were making preparations before they tore into us. When we got to the deck, we realized that they were running towards the cargo hold of the ship, and I vaguely heard from one of the Thai sailors that there were stowaways hiding in there, and at that time the sailors were rushing in like they had found gold. When stowaways are found on board a ship, their fate is miserable. Because they don't have visas, once the ship docks and is detected by local customs, they are subject to heavy penalties and administrative entanglements. Many ruthless captains would simply order their sailors to throw the stowaways overboard, eliminating a potential source of trouble for themselves. And Basadi is one of those who often does just that. I followed those straggling feet to see what was going on. This oval-shaped warehouse was piled high with the goods of the signers, and many sacks were stacked together like a small mountain. A couple of sailors raised their oil lamps above their heads and shone into the back corners of the tall sacks, and there really were two dirty little guys huddled together, shivering. The sailor with the hairy, monkey-like body rushed eagerly inside. Grabbing the hair of one of them, he yanked it out, and with excitement in his mouth, he shouted, "It's a girl, 2 children." My heart just sank at that time. These villains were so excited, they must be trying to them. One of the sailors standing outside also responded excitedly in Thai. "Now there's something to play with. Every day we can have a good time. And then when the ship is almost docked, we'll throw them out to sea and feed them to the fishes." Ha 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 ha. Old Basadi stood by without speaking, but with a lecherous smile piled on his face. A little girl with a slender body, wrapped in a dirty, greasy goatskin coat, was pulled out, and the girl squirmed desperately, trying to free herself from the hands that were gripping her aching hair. When I saw those big watery eyes, I was stunned. "Poe, it's actually Poe. Why is she back on this ship?" Hot blood rushed to my chest. I swung my hands, shook off the 2 sailors standing in front of me, and grabbed the monkey-looking sailor by the neck. 2 clucks and the sound of a misplaced knot in his throat issued forth. All the sailors looked at me in surprise. One sailor who was thrown down by me screamed loudly and lunged at me. I raised my foot and kicked him in the abdomen. He immediately flew out, kneeling in the doorway of the warehouse, his mouth vomiting uncontrollably. Several sailors rushed over to help him. Seeing this, the French rogue gasped and came towards me with his well-developed pectoral muscles stretched out angrily. Old Basadi, however, pulled him back, signaling the Frenchman to take it easy. "Huh." Basadi laughed twice, narrowed his eyes viciously, and said to me, "Mr. Wayne wants to mind his own business? We're business partners. Don't hurt our chances for 2 little pussies. It's fine if you want to play with these 2 girls first, but I promise I won't let them stay on the ship and soil my good name for honoring international treaties. The girl is here to see me, and I, Wayne, am responsible for her safety. If Mr. Bassett is worried about customs inspections, I can give you half the profits from the shipment. With the money you can buy the women for a quickie, how about selling me a favor?" As I spoke, I scanned the sailors behind me with my eyes. In my years of experience as a mercenary, outlaw villains are always good at sneaking up from behind. Although Basadi was a shriveled old man, he was very experienced in the jungle, and he knew that I had once killed 7 team members of equal caliber in less than 2 minutes. It would be costly to fight me to the death. Just rolling his eyes, he pondered the offer I made. The sailor I had grabbed by the throat had let go of Poe and was suffocating and rolling his eyes. Not wanting to kill him and get myself into more trouble, I pushed him back down to the ground. Poe jumped into my arms with tears in her eyes and hugged me tightly around the waist, whimpering, "Sarit, she's in there too?" I patted Poe on the shoulder, eyes still alert to the rogue sailors around us, and told her to go pull Sarit out. She immediately wiped her eyes and ran over to pull Sarit out. "Mr. Basadi, as you can see, both girls are here to see me." Knowing that this old man was treacherous, I let him make his conditions, and he could see that the two girls must not be moved. Only the idea of my shipment could be hit. "Oh, Wayne, I know you're a special forces soldier and kill people, but I have more than a dozen men and more than a dozen muskets. It's not good to hurt the peace, but my men have to eat and play with women, right? You give me all the profits from this cargo." I can also explain to everyone. Although the little old man was small, his ambition was not small. Chapter 5. The woman tied under the cabin. Chapter 5. The woman tied under the cabin. I heard the meaning of his words, obviously wanting to rob me, but a strong dragon can't suppress a snake, plus taking care of the safety of the two girls. It is true that one's hands are tied when tearing them apart. Then he generously said to Basadi, "Good. Money is something outside the body, and it is worth it to make friends with all of you." Sarit, his hair disheveled and his terrified eyes gazing around, leaned against my back, posting close to me. I glanced at the old Basadi and then at the warehouse door and signaled them to get out of the way. I motioned for the two girls to go out first, to the deck outside. I myself, still in combat-ready position, stepped back out. Dragging the two little girls with me, I ran into my rented cabin. Poe and Sarit couldn't hold back their tears as soon as they entered the cabin and hugged me. I knew that they must have suffered a lot in the past 5 days. Poe lifted her dirty little face, blinked her tears, and looked at me and said, "I'm sorry. We shouldn't have come here, causing you to lose all your goods." I laughed and stroked both of their heads and said, "Silly girls, if they dare to take away one of my sacks of goods, I'll crack their heads open. It's not that I'm not true to my word. It's that they're taking advantage of the situation and blackmailing me, and they're asking for it by dying. We can't be sure if we're safe now. Maybe in the middle of the night they'll swoop in. Basadi is old and cunning." In the evening, Sarit and I were hiding in the cargo hold when we heard the cries of a woman below. It must be these bad guys doing something bad. Poe finished and looked at Sarit. Sarit nodded at me. I asked Poe if what he heard was a crazy woman speaking English. Poe shook his head and thought for a moment and said to me, "No, it sounded like Japanese. She was probably being hurt or tortured, and her cries were heartbreaking to hear." I then remembered the woman holding the child who was rescued today, and had the impression that the child was wrapped in kimono-like clothing. Those guys must have been wreaking havoc on this frail woman. I said to the two of them, "Wait for me here. Don't go anywhere. Take this gun and open the door when you hear my voice. Whenever there is danger, shoot them." Before traveling from the town, I had brought a total of 3 pistols and 2 long guns, one of which was a long-range shooting rifle, specifically for use against pirates. I pinned the 2 pistols to my haunches, slung one of the mill guns on my back, and surreptitiously sought my way to the storehouse on the underside of the deck. Up on deck, I noticed that the captain's room was lit up, and a lot of figures were hanging around in there, probably discussing what had just happened, or more likely discussing how to deal with me later. By the hazy moonlight, I quietly returned to the cargo hold and found a wooden crate placed extraordinarily conspicuously on the plank in the middle, and I thought that the Japanese woman must still be down there. Pushing open the wooden box, it was indeed a plank that could be uncovered. Time was running out and I had to move faster. After opening it, I burrowed inside, where 2 paraffin lamps hung and straw was all over my feet. A naked woman, stripped naked, was tied to a post in the corner. After seeing me come in, the woman was immediately fearful and uneasy. I jumped over with an arrow and covered her mouth that was just about to cry out. She was still shaking her head frantically, whimpering sounds coming out of her mouth, and her 2 terrified eyes staring at me in panic. I made a motion to her to be quiet, and when she saw the weapon on me, she realized that I was here to save her, not her up as a villain. At that moment, there was a sudden rumble at the entrance and a sailor roamed inside. Damn! 1 step ahead of me, It's time for me to have a quickie. With that, a foot reached down. I instantly tumbled into a dark corner and hid first, because it's not certain how many people are up there right now. Down comes the Malaysian sailor, hairy as a monkey. He smiled lewdly and walked towards the naked woman, unzipping his trousers as he went. When he reached her, his hands grabbed the woman's C***K and rubbed it hard. The woman felt the pain and started to cry. The woman's cries stimulated this villain's desire even more. He pulled out his belt and his trousers swished to the floor. This guy used the belt towards the woman's thighs twice. The woman's voice of pain was even louder, while he hemmed and hawed and smiled, spread the woman's snow-white thighs, pushed his buttocks forward, violated into the woman's body, and began to bang hard. Being now sure out that he had come down alone, I crept up behind him, and, as soon as I had covered his mouth with my left hand, the Swiss dagger in my right easily cut the knot of his throat. In order that the woman might not be sprayed with ebony blood, I raked the dead man's head down hard enough to allow the blood to flow down gently, and then dragged the body into a dark corner. Just as I turned back to untie the ropes from the woman's body, there was another rattle at the entrance. I crouched anxiously back into the dark corner and ambushed. This time it was the French rogue who came down, with 2 followers by his side. They were talking and joking with each other while pointing and gesticulating at the woman. The strong Frenchman spoke Thai and said to his 2 followers, "The 3 of us will go together. I'm going to use her mouth, and the 2 of you will mess with her backside at the same time. Make sure you stuff it." The 2 followers seemed to be very happy that the Frenchman didn't try to steal their favorite parts, and smiled lewdly on their faces. Just as the 3 of them monkeyed around to untie the ropes binding the woman, I stomped on the barn wall behind me with my right foot, letting myself shoot my body out like a bow and arrow, tumbling onto my heel to reach the 3 of them, and thrusting 2 daggers into the ribs of 2 of my followers, who collapsed without being able to let out a single yell. Then I got up and attacked the step, swinging the knife to stab the Frenchman in the heart, but unexpectedly this burly guy jumped back in a hurry to avoid it. When I swung my second knife, he kicked me in the side of the temple, and after the kick fell short, he took up a Chinese kung fu stance against me. Although my body was half Chinese, all I was familiar with was Muay Thai and military combat. After a few rounds, I couldn't find a chance to stab him. In order not to create a ruckus and invite accomplices, I lunged over to him and wrestled with him in close quarters. He was strong enough to move and turn my wrists, gradually forcing the sharp edge of the dagger I held in my hand towards my chest. Just in the nick of time, there was a thud and a thick wooden stick hit the Frenchman on the head. It turned out that the Japanese woman had broken away from the ropes and picked up a weapon that even a woman would use to help me. The force of the blow wasn't strong enough, and the Frenchman just shook his head violently to keep himself awake. But the blow was a big help to me, as I gathered my strength in my toes, lifted my right leg, and kicked Frenchie hard in the back of the head. He was in momentary pain, and one hand reflexively came free to stroke the sore spot. I seized the moment, rolled over and pinned him underneath me, and pressed the tip of the knife downwards towards his heart again. He resisted with all his strength, and I, fearing that more villains might come down from outside, fought him with brute force against all odds. After about 2 minutes of stalemate, beads of soybean-sized sweat sprang up on Frenchie's head, while I was equally sweating. Since I was on top, a sweat drop just happened to get into his eye, and he was in a moment of pain and itching with no way out, so he could only keep his other eye open for me to rip it out. I intentionally dripped more sweat from my face into this eye he had open, but he already had the sense of protecting his eye, and it was difficult for me to succeed in stabbing him to death for a moment. As a result of the excessive writhing, my sheepskin kangaroo suddenly tore open, revealing my hard chest, and this Frenchman suddenly saw the cross-cutting scar on my chest, and his face showed extra panic. For a moment, I felt my opponent's strength diminish by half. I charged with vigor, and the whole dagger did not enter his heart. Afterwards, I reversed the handle of the knife, because my years of experience in killing people told me that when killing bulky enemies, I must increase the strength of the kill, or else I would likely suffer a fatal sneak attack from the other party before dying. Drawing my dagger, I wiped the bloody blade dry on the dead body's chest lapel and inserted it back into the sheath behind my calf. I took the Japanese woman's hand and climbed out sharply upwards. When I reached the deck, I found that many sailors, even more armed with guns, were running to my cabin. They thought I must be asleep in my own little hammock at this time, but they didn't know that I was right behind them with a mirror and snatch. On going up the side of the ship, which was a narrow straight aisle, I pulled the trigger, and not one of the 8 sailors escaped, being either shot or pierced by a bullet. But I did not see the old fellow Basadi. I told the Japanese woman to crouch in a dark corner and not make a sound or move until I returned. She wisely took my meaning and nodded to me. I went to the captain's cabin and Basadi was calling on one of the radios, 33 degrees south. East Sea Devil Captain, please back me up. That guy is trying to rob us of our drugs. I rested on the window glass and shot him with single-shot accuracy. But seriously, I only heard the latitude, not the longitude. The ship was off course when it spotted Poe and Sarita a while back, and the Sea Devils are an internationally wanted pirate organization that sells drugs, burns and kills, and does everything in their power to be brutal. It turns out that Basadi has been colluding with them all along. I knew I had to get out of this area of the sea in a hurry, or when the pirates came to meet us, we were certain death. I went back and pulled up the Japanese woman, found her a sheepskin shawl to wear, and found the Japanese woman's child in the cabin where the crazy woman was locked up. The mad woman was dead, strangled as it seemed. They thought the Japanese woman would be a replacement. Finding the only miniature raft on board and taking Sarit and Poe with us, we got away from the snow in time. It could not now be ascertained whether it was west or east of Amherst Island. In order to find early islands to land on in the inhospitable Indian Ocean, we had only to glide westward, and either Amherst Island or the Edward Islands awaited us. If, within 5 days, no island is found in the vast expanse of the sea, hunger and thirst will donate us to the sea. This little rubber raft carries our entire lives under God's watchful eye and test. At the slightest negligence on our part or God's, the door at the end of another world will open to welcome our strange souls,